You're competent enough to follow orders, Natalie. Let's hope you remember that's all you'll ever be. That is what Dr. Marcus Hayes said 47 minutes before the ambulance brought in the general who would destroy everything he'd built. Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland hums with the white noise of fluorescent lights and the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic. The ER smells like bleach and something underneath it, copper and fear, the particular stench of human bodies breaking down. Natalie Hayes moves through the corridor like water finding the path of least resistance, her white coat immaculate, her badge clipped precisely at chest level, her name stitched small enough that most people don't bother reading it. She's been invisible here for 3 years. She prefers it that way. Her hands move with the kind of precision that comes from repetition and muscle memory, from a decade of work that nobody here knows about. The 4 line slides into the elderly man's vein with a single practice motion, no hesitation, no fumbling. The needle finds the vessel like it has eyes. Her hands are steady. They have always been steady. A faint tremor runs through her left hand sometimes when ambulance sirens wail too loud in the early morning, but she learned a long time ago to tape her fingers to a clipboard when it happens. Nobody notices. Nobody is supposed to. She's working the night shift trauma bay when Dr. Hayes walks past the observation window, his spine rigid as a steel rod, his shoulders carrying the weight of his title like armor. Chief of Surgery. Yale Medical School. A fellowship at Johns Hopkins. Board certified in 3 specialties. He stops, watching her work. She doesn't look up. She's placing a second line, speaking in low even tones to the patient, "You're doing great." 2 seconds. That's it. And her voice carries the kind of authority that makes other people's hands steady without knowing why. Dr. Hayes' jaw tightens. She can feel his attention the way prey animals feel a predator's focus, a pressure change in the air that has nothing to do with the ventilation system. The truth is that Marcus Hayes built himself from nothing. Middle-class Cincinnati. His father was a tool and die maker who died when Marcus was 14, leaving a funeral bill and a mortgage and a bitter mother who worked 2 jobs to pay for his pre-med classes. He clawed his way through state school on scholarships and pride, survived residency on spite, and by age 42 he had constructed a version of Marcus Hayes that was unassailable. The credentials were real. The achievements were documented. The photographs of him in surgical scrubs, hands poised over open cavities, face lit by overhead surgical lights, they were all real. And for 2 decades, they had been enough. Until she arrived. Natalie Hayes came to Sacred Heart with a transfer request from a clinic in Seattle, a blank resume that listed only emergency medical services and patient care coordination, and a reference that simply said competent. Reliable. Available immediately. She was interviewed by a junior HR associate who didn't ask the right questions. She was hired by a shift supervisor who was desperate for night staff. No one looked at her carefully. No one asked why a woman with her obvious skill level was working as a floor nurse instead of pursuing advancement, leadership, a fellowship, a title. She didn't want a title. She wanted to move through her shifts without notice, to heal people in the dark, to spend her evenings alone in a studio apartment that contained almost nothing, a bed, a desk, and a single locked drawer where she kept a field journal with pressed desert flowers. Certain flowers pressed between pages numbered in fading pencil. Certain dates written beside them. Nothing else. But Marcus Hayes had built his entire identity on being the smartest person in the room, and Natalie Hayes carried an authority that had nothing to do with degrees or publications or the number of surgeries on a CV. When she was in the trauma bay, people listened. Not because she was loud. Because she was right. Her hands moved with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than training. Her voice dropped into a register that made younger residents obey without question. She saw problems before they materialized, sepsis signatures in a patient's lab work, early signs of stroke in a speech pattern, the subtle angle of a fracture that others had missed. And Marcus Hayes, who had spent 30 years accumulating the credentials to be the voice that made people listen, found himself watching a floor nurse save lives with a level of instinct that could not be taught in any classroom. It gnawed at him. It shouldn't have, but it did. she touched something in him that he had spent his entire adult life burying, the knowledge that you could have all the right letters after your name and still be watching someone operate from a place of genuine competence that existed without permission. That was the word he kept using when he thought about it, alone in his office after midnight, staring at his medical school diploma framed in walnut. Permission. She didn't need it. She didn't ask for it. She simply moved through her work as if she had every right to be the most capable person in the room, and that particular flavor of confidence, not arrogance, but something deeper, something earned, made his chest feel tight. So he had started watching her more carefully. He noticed that she never corrected anyone directly. She guided. She suggested. She asked careful questions that led people to their own conclusions. Walk me through your reasoning on that dosage. And the resident would suddenly see their own error. Brilliant. Infuriating. The kind of approach that made you feel like you'd learned something instead of being corrected, which was why people trusted her, which was why, and this was the part that made his hands feel cold, people looked to her in crisis situations instead of to the physicians in the room. That morning, 47 minutes before the ambulance alert, he had pulled her aside in the supply closet. It wasn't a real confrontation. It was worse than that. It was calibrated. He had spent his morning preparing her file, reviewing her shifts, noting that she had assisted on Dr. Patel's trauma cases and that, coincidentally, those cases had better outcomes than his own. The inference was plain. The manipulation was artful. He had set it up perfectly. I've noticed you've been gravitating toward the complex cases, he said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. That's admirable. But we have protocols for a reason. Let's hope you remember that competence in this environment is defined by following those protocols, not deciding when they should be bent. She had looked at him for exactly 1 second. Her eyes were the color of stormlight. She didn't answer. She had simply reached past him for the gauze, her shoulder brushing his chest, and walked back out to the floor. That was the moment he decided that she would remember this conversation. That she would regret whatever pride was making her move through Sacred Heart Hospital like she belonged here, like she had something he didn't have. That he would make sure she understood her place. He didn't know who she was. Not really. He knew the surface details: divorced, no children, shared a studio apartment with someone's cat that he'd seen once in the break room. He knew she worked every holiday without complaint. He knew that other nurses sought her out for advice, which was technically a protocol violation. He knew that the residents shadowed her movements in the trauma bay like she was teaching a masterclass they weren't supposed to be attending. But he didn't know the thing underneath all of that. He didn't know that the flowers she touched between shifts were from a place called Marjah, where she had served as a special forces combat medic with the kind of casualty rates that would have broken most people. He didn't know that she had refused an illegal order from a 4-star general, that her refusal to abandon wounded civilians had cost her everything: her career, her clearance, her name in any official record. He didn't know she was a ghost. That she had traded a decorated life for this one. That she would never fight for advancement or recognition because she was already carrying honors that would have made his credentials look like Boy Scout badges. All he knew was that she made him feel small, and he was going to fix that. The ambulance alert comes at 14:47. 2 seconds of the electronic alert followed by the dispatcher's voice cutting through the radio in the station: incoming trauma. Male, age 74, blunt force chest trauma, car versus pole at high speed. Unstable vitals. ETA for minutes. Then the follow-up, the part that makes everyone's posture change: patient is military VIP. General rank. The ER goes very still. Not silent, the monitors keep beeping, the ventilators keep wheezing, the coffee machine keeps gurgling in the break room, but still in the way that a room goes still when the temperature drops and everyone feels it. Nurses exchange glances. Residents straighten their shoulders. A phone rings somewhere in administration. 4-star generals don't come to Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, Oregon. They have access to Walter Reed, to Bethesda Naval Hospital, to facilities with the kind of security clearance and infrastructure that can handle that level of rank. The fact that this one is coming here means the injury was witnessed at the moment it happened, means the nearest level 1 trauma center was Sacred Heart, means they brought him where the nearest competent hands were instead of waiting for special accommodations. Natalie pulls on a fresh pair of gloves. Latex snaps against her wrists like a starting gun. She checks the trauma bay equipment with the kind of methodical precision that comes from muscle memory, from a decade of preparing for incoming casualties. For line staged. Oxygen tanks full. Defibrillator pads charged. Everything in its place. Everything ready. The automatic doors at the main entrance burst open and the parking lot wind rushes in, carrying the smell of rain on hot asphalt. Sirens wail closer. Closer. The stretcher appears first, the paramedics moving with the controlled urgency of people who know the patient matters. Then the face, blood-streaked, the left side of the chest caved in slightly, breathing shallow and wrong. And Natalie goes very still in a different way, the way a creature goes still when it recognizes something from another lifetime. The overhead page crackled across Sacred Heart at 7:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the entire ER floor heard it, paging Nightingale Natalie to the nurse's station. Nightingale Natalie, your fairy dust is needed at the desk. Laughter rippled across the trauma bay like wind through dry grass. 2 residents exchanged glances. A tech covering a smirk with his clipboard. The nickname had started small, a joke about her uncanny ability to appear when patients were crashing, as if she could sense collapse before the monitor screamed, but in Dr. Marcus Hayes's mouth, it had transformed into something else entirely. A diminishment. A reduction of a decorated combat medic to a magical creature, something less than human, less than credible, less than real. Natalie was replacing the central line kit in Trauma Bay 3 when the page came through. She didn't pause. She didn't look up. She simply closed the cabinet with a soft click, walked to the nurse's station with measured steps, her face composed as stone, and found Dr. Hayes leaning against the counter with his arms crossed like a prosecutor preparing to cross-examine a hostile witness. His tailored Burberry scarf hung perfectly arranged over his white coat. His posture radiated the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of having every room bent toward you. Just wanted to remind you that we follow evidence-based medicine here at Sacred Heart, Dr. Hayes said, loud enough for the charge nurse and 2 nearby residents to hear. Not intuition. Not hunches. Not whatever training you picked up before you decided nursing was the better career move. He smiled without warmth. I know evidence-based practice can be hard for some people, especially those without formal medical training. Natalie took one measured breath. The air tasted like antiseptic and his cologne, something expensive that couldn't quite cover the scent of his fear. She'd spent 18 years reading body language in high-stress environments. Fear wore a scent. It always did. Evidence is only useful to people who know how to read it, doctor, she said quietly. Her voice carried the kind of flat calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Some of us prefer to watch instead. She turned and walked back toward the supply room. Behind her, she heard Dr. Hayes's laugh, a bark meant for the audience, but the sting of it still found her. In the medication supply closet, surrounded by colored tape and labeled syringes, she allowed herself one tear. Just one. It traced down her cheek like a raindrop finding its path down a window. She wiped it away before it could fall, pressing the heel of her hand against her eye socket once, hard, the way you reset a joint that's dislocated. When she turned back to the door, her face was dry. Her eyes were clear. The moment had passed. But it wasn't over. 3 days later, Dr. Hayes was waiting for her in the medication supply closet. She'd come in at 6:15 p.m. for her shift, moving down the hallway toward the supply room to help restock, a routine action, a moment of quiet work, when Dr. Hayes stepped in after her and closed the door. The space was small. White shelving on 3 walls. Tall enough to stand in, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without touching. He positioned himself between her and the exit, his body filling the doorway like a barrier, like a warning. I've been reviewing your charts, Natalie, he said, his voice dropping into the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing a secret threat. Going back through your documentation. And I found some concerning discrepancies. Medication logs that don't quite add up. Sloppy documentation. The kind of thing that administration takes very seriously. The kind of thing that ends careers. His breath smelled like coffee and mint gum. His cologne filled the small space, invasive as smoke. He stood too close, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, close enough that the positioning itself was an assertion of dominance. This was stage 3 of his campaign. No longer the public mockery. Now the strategic intimidation. The threat delivered in private, where witnesses could only imagine what had been said. Natalie didn't step backward. She'd been trained by the 75th Ranger Regiment. She'd survived Marjah. She'd held the femoral artery of a 19-year-old kid named Petty Officer Gomez while his blood soaked through the gauze so fast she had to keep layering more on top. Pressure, pressure, more pressure, and she'd whispered his mother's name to him, Maria, 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 because he kept asking for her as his blood pressure dropped. This man in his $3,000 suit was not a threat. He was a child throwing rocks at a tank, hoping to hear a sound. "Show me the discrepancies," she said. His smile widened. "I don't need to show you anything, Natalie. I just need you to understand how precarious your position is here at Sacred Heart. How easily these kinds of concerns could find their way to the board. How quickly a nursing license can become a liability instead of an asset." She met his eyes. Held them. Let him see that the fear he was trying to manufacture had no soil to grow in. "You'll remember this conversation differently than I will," she said. The words hung in the small space between them. Not a threat. Not a prediction. A simple statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has already made peace with their own erasure. She stepped forward, not aggressively, just a single step, and he stepped back reflexively, his body moving away from her advance, and she walked past him and back out into the hallway. Behind her, she could feel him standing in the supply closet doorway, watching her go, his face flushed with something between rage and disbelief. That evening, Dr. Hayes made 3 calls from his office. The first was to Richard Brennan, a hospital board president who owed Hayes a favor for a complex bypass surgery he'd performed on Brennan's father. The second was to another board member named Catherine Wu, and the third was to the Oregon State Board of Nursing. He described Natalie in measured, professional tones. He used words like concerning pattern, questionable judgment, possible credential misrepresentation. He didn't need to lie. He just needed to cast nets wide enough that something would catch. A week later, on a rain-soaked Tuesday at 6:52 p.m., Natalie pulled into the Sacred Heart parking lot for her shift. The forecast had predicted clear skies. Instead, the clouds had rolled in from nowhere, the way they do in Portland, sudden, cold, carrying the weight of winter even though summer was still 3 weeks away. She was walking across the asphalt toward the employee entrance when Dr. Hayes stepped in front of her from between 2 parked cars. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a charge nurse named Patricia Gomez, no relation to the 19-year-old whose name Natalie still whispered to herself sometimes at 3 a.m., and 2 other nurses Natalie recognized from the night shifts. An audience. A panel. A tribunal. Effective immediately, Dr. Hayes announced, his voice pitched to carry across the parking lot, "You're no longer charge nurse. You'll be taking standard patient assignments like everyone else. Your clinical judgment has been questionable lately. We've made the decision as a department that this change best serves our patients and our institution." The rain fell harder. It drummed against the pavement, a sound like static, like the universe's white noise. Natalie's hand trembled once, just once, a single involuntary muscle contraction that she felt before she could stop it. She watched Dr. Hayes register it, saw the satisfaction flicker across his face like a spark catching fuel. She clenched her fist, once, hard, and felt the trembling still itself. One tear escaped. Not a sob. Not a dramatic gesture. Just a single tear that traced down her left cheekbone, clear as water. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, her movement slow and deliberate, as if to acknowledge, "Yes, I feel this. And I'm choosing to move forward anyway. Understood, she said. She walked past all of them toward the hospital entrance. Behind her, she heard Patricia Gomez say something low to the others, heard the wet scrape of Dr. Hayes's shoes on the asphalt as he followed inside, already pulling his phone from his pocket. She knew what he was doing. She knew what came next. He was calling the hospital board. He was describing a nurse who'd just been demoted for questionable judgment. He was building a file. He was constructing a narrative. What he didn't understand, what his entire campaign had failed to account for, was that she wasn't trying to hide who she was anymore. She was tired of hiding. For 3 years, she'd worn anonymity like armor, letting people see only the surface nurse, the night shift worker, the quiet, competent woman who never asked for credit and never demanded recognition. She'd wrapped herself in invisibility because the truth of what she'd done, what she'd been, was too heavy to carry in public spaces. But heavy things, Natalie had learned in combat, don't become lighter when you carry them alone. They become heavier. They distort your spine. They reshape your skeleton until you're bent permanently around the weight. The shift passed in a haze of routine work. She took her standard patient assignments, 2 trauma admits, 1 post-op, 1 critical, and moved through her rounds with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from muscle memory. Around 10 p.m., she was in Trauma Bay 2 changing a dressing when the ambulance bay doors burst open and paramedics rushed through with a patient on a stretcher. The overhead page hadn't come yet. The trauma alert shattering the Tuesday night shift with the kind of urgency that makes everyone move at once. Critical incoming. VIP status. Military transport. The paramedics wheeled the patient toward the trauma bay nearest the entrance, and Natalie heard the charge nurse directing them, Trauma Bay 1. But her hand stopped moving. Her breath caught. Because the patient's left arm had slipped free from the stretcher during transport, and even with the trauma blankets covering most of his uniform, she could see the collar insignia clearly, for stars. General Officer rank. The patient's face was visible for only a moment, blood-streaked, the left side of his chest caved in slightly, breathing shallow and wrong, but that moment was enough. Enough to stop time. Enough to reach backward through 3 years of careful anonymity and pull up a memory she'd spent every night trying to bury. General Marcus Morrison. 4-star commander of Joint Special Operations Command. The man who'd sat across from her in a JG hearing and signed the court-martial papers that had ended her military career. The man whose signature had transformed her from a decorated combat medic into a person who couldn't exist anymore, at least not with her real name, her real rank, her real history. The man was coding. His oxygen saturation was dropping, she could see it on the portable monitor the paramedics were running, and his chest wall wasn't expanding symmetrically on either side. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped between his lung and his chest wall, collapsing the lung, compressing his heart, killing him one breath at a time. Dr. Hayes arrived like a thunderclap, taking in the scene with a surgeon's practiced eye. She saw his expression shift when he registered the 4 stars on the general's collar. She saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, opportunity, liability, leverage, all of it flickering across his face in the space of a single second. This patient, Dr. Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the trauma bay, has complex military and legal entanglements. We need to be extremely cautious about potential conflicts of interest. Anyone with prior military service should probably recuse themselves from his care. We wouldn't want any complications. Any breach of protocol. He looked directly at Natalie. The general's pressure was dropping. 80/40. 70/30. His eyes were still open, still conscious, which meant he was aware that he was dying. Which meant Natalie had approximately 3 minutes before his heart would stop beating and no amount of machinery in the world could bring him back. 3 minutes before everything changed. 2 residents stepped backward, hands up in compliance, understanding the subtext perfectly, stay away from this patient. Another attending was already reaching for his phone, murmuring something about calling in a specialist from Oregon Health. The charge nurse looked paralyzed, caught between protocol and crisis. The paramedic, an older man with a scarred face and the kind of weathered competence that comes from 15 years running calls in combat zones, looked at Natalie. Just looked at her. His paramedic bag was still open on the side table, and inside it, she could see an MRE packet he'd been eating during the transport, some kind of chicken teriyaki, the kind Natalie hadn't eaten since Kandahar. Her hand started moving. Not as a decision. Not as a choice. As pure instinct. As muscle memory that had been waiting 3 years for this moment. She was already assessing the general's chest, already calculating the landmarks for needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, already moving toward the equipment. "He'll be dead in 3 minutes," she said quietly. Dr. Hayes stepped directly in front of her, his body creating a physical barrier between her and the patient. "Stand down, Nurse Hayes," he said. "That's an order." She moved around him toward the general without breaking stride. The trauma alert screamed through Sacred Heart's overhead speakers at 2:47 p.m., a Tuesday afternoon when the ER was moving through the doldrums of post-lunch stability. Code trauma. Incoming critical. ETA for minutes. The words meant nothing and everything if another stretcher, another set of vitals climbing the monitor, another chance to hold the line between breathing and not breathing. Natalie was restocking the crash cart in Trauma Bay 3 when she heard the charge nurse call her name. Not a request. A command. The kind of voice that meant the patient mattered, that the case was already heavy before the ambulance doors even cracked open. She set down the ambu bag and moved toward the receiving area without hesitation, muscle memory overriding the small voice that still lived in her chest, the voice that whispered about rest days and quiet nights. The ambulance bay doors burst open like a percussion strike. 2 paramedics wheeling a stretcher, the patient's chest wrapped in field bandaging, blood seeping through the edges in a slow dark bloom. The charge nurse was already moving, calling out vitals in that staccato rhythm that meant speed and precision. Systolic pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation in the low 70s. Breath sounds absent on the left side. The patient was a man, maybe mid-60s, with a kind of bearing that didn't disappear even unconscious and bleeding. Natalie's hands moved to the stretcher rail as they crossed into Trauma Bay 3, her eyes scanning the patient's face. The moment stretched like taffy pulled thin, like the split second between a decision and its consequence. She knew this face. Not from Sacred Heart. Not from Portland. From a desert compound in Helmand Province. From a briefing room where she'd stood with her shoulders back and her voice steady, refusing an order that would have left 3 wounded civilians in a kill zone so that an extraction could proceed on schedule. General Morrison. 4-star. The signature on the court-martial order. The man whose voice had been soft as a scalpel when he'd read the charges: insubordination, failure to follow direct command, breach of military protocol. The room tilted. She steadied herself against the rail. Tension pneumothorax on the left, one of the paramedics was saying. Vehicle versus pedestrian. Impact trauma, multiple injuries. He's got active duty military status and VIP clearance, so we've got the brass en route for briefing. The charge nurse was already calling for more hands. Get 2 large bore 4s. Typo negative standing by. Chest tube set up, now. Her eyes moved across the bay and landed on Dr. Hayes, who'd appeared in the doorway like something summoned by bad luck and worse choices. He was staring at the patient with an expression that shifted through confusion and then something darker, something that looked almost like calculation. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his posture the rigid perfection of institutional authority. "I'll take this case. Get me a full workup." Pressure's dropping, Natalie said quietly. Her voice had changed. The deferential timbre was gone, replaced by something flat and precise. The voice of someone who had made decisions while rounds fired in the distance. 70/40 and falling. He's not getting oxygen. The other doctors in the bay shifted. One of them, a resident named Chen, glanced at Dr. Hayes and took a half-step back. Another doctor, the attending from Trauma 2, exchanged a look with the charge nurse that carried volumes of silent understanding. "This patient has military VIP status," Dr. Hayes said, his voice tight. "There are legal entanglements that make this complicated. We need to call administration. We need to decompress his chest," Natalie interrupted, and now the edge in her voice was sharp enough to cut. She was already moving, already reaching for the trauma tray, her muscle memory pulling her into a rhythm that had nothing to do with Portland or Sacred Heart or the careful anonymity she'd built over 7 years. "He's got no breath sounds on the left. That's not complicated. That's physics." Dr. Hayes's jaw tightened. "You're a nurse. You'll follow the chain of command here, which starts with." Natalie moved around him toward the patient, not fast, not slow, but with the kind of fluid precision that made the room go quiet. Her hands were already steady. They were already moving. The EMT had left his jump bag on the stretcher rail, and she grabbed it, running her fingers through the contents with the speed of someone who had done this in dust storms and sandstorms and the kind of chaos that came when the rules of medicine had to bend or people died. There. An MRE package, unopened, the foil backing intact. Not what she would have chosen if she'd had time to choose, but time was the one resource that was running out. The general's oxygen saturation was in the 60s now. His lips were taking on the pale, waxy look of someone whose body was shutting down, redirecting blood from the periphery, preparing for the end. She tore open the package with her teeth, spat the corner away, and the movement was so economical, so without hesitation, that no one in the bay tried to stop her. 14-gauge needle, she said. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I need someone to prep his chest. Chen moved before Dr. Hayes could speak, swabbing the general's upper chest with chlorhexidine, the smell of antiseptic rising sharp and chemical into the bay's recycled air. Natalie's fingers found the landmarks, the second rib, the space beneath it, the thin membrane of skin that separated breathing from drowning. She felt the resistance, the give, and then the sudden rush of pressurized air escaping from the pleural space. The hiss of air filled the silence like a small violence. The general's chest rose. His oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed with the steadiness of a promise being kept. 68. 73. 81. Natalie secured the MRE package over the needle site with tape, creating a one-way valve that would let air escape but not enter. It was a field expedient from a field medicine course she'd taken in places whose names weren't on most maps. It was the kind of thing you learned when the nearest hospital was 3 hours away and the nearest surgeon was a combat medic with 4 hours of emergency surgery training and a prayer. Chest tube setup, she said, her voice the kind of quiet that filled the whole room. We need to get a proper tube in place before the bleeding pressure builds again. And I want imaging. You are practicing outside your scope, Dr. Hayes said. His voice was controlled, but beneath it lived something raw and fraying. He was staring at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the way she'd moved around him without asking permission, the way her hands had known what to do without hesitation, the way the room had gone still and held its breath in that peculiar silence that comes when someone steps into their true self and there's no pretending otherwise. She didn't look at him. She adjusted the tape on the MRE packaging, checking the seal, confirming the one-way function. The general's pressure was stabilizing. His oxygen saturation held at 87. His pupils were still reactive, still human. Chest tube setup, she repeated, this time not to Dr. Hayes but to Chen, to the charge nurse, to the body of medical professionals in the bay who understood that the hierarchy of intelligence in this room had just been rearranged. And get vascular in here. We've got internal bleeding, and I want his abdomen scanned before we lose him. The charge nurse was already on the phone, calling down to imaging, and Dr. Hayes was backing toward the door with an expression like someone watching his territory being mapped by a stranger. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with a precision that looked rehearsed, and then he turned and walked out of the trauma bay. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next came in small increments that seemed unconnected until they weren't. Natalie worked through the stabilization protocol with the focus of someone who had done this before and would do this again. The general remained critical but stable, hanging in that narrow margin between survival and collapse. By the time the chest tube was placed and his bleeding had been partially controlled through aggressive fluid resuscitation, 6 hours had evaporated like morning mist. The trauma bay had transformed into a holding pattern, the emergency phase over, the long fight beginning. She was adjusting the ventilator settings when the charge nurse appeared at her shoulder, and even before the words came out, Natalie knew from the woman's expression that the real crisis had already started somewhere else. Hayes made calls, the charge nurse said quietly. To the board president, to administration, to someone at the state licensing office. He's saying you performed a procedure without authorization. That you're exposing the hospital to liability. Natalie's hands didn't stop moving. She checked the ventilator pressure, the oxygen mixture, the steady rise and fall of the general's chest. The patient was in arrest. Tension pneumothorax. It was emergency medicine. I know that, the charge nurse said. I know that. But Hayes knows how to make noise, and he's been making it for the past 3 hours. They're talking about pulling you from this case. They're talking about suspending your license pending investigation. The general's monitor beeped in its steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The kind of heart that would have stopped without the improvisation, without the MRE package and a nurse who remembered how to function when institutional rules became obstacles to survival. Natalie didn't respond. She was watching the numbers on the screen, the oxygen saturation holding at 90%, the blood pressure stable at 105/63, the heart rate at a manageable 116. She was watching the general's face, looking for the small signs of response, the minute changes in consciousness that meant his brain was still there, still fighting, still alive. 30 seconds. That's all it took to know what was going to happen next. Dr. Hayes is coming back, the charge nurse said. He's bringing someone from HR. He's going to. The general's abdomen monitor alarmed. Pressure dropping. Internal bleeding accelerating. And before anyone could move, before Dr. Hayes could return with his hierarchy and his authority and his carefully constructed network of allies, Natalie was moving again, her hand steady as surgical steel, her voice the kind of command that made residents straighten their spines and move without questioning. The general's lung was collapsing. Natalie saw it in the O2 monitor, 68% and falling, saw it in his pallor, in the way his body was shutting down under the weight of his own blood filling the space around his lung. Tension pneumothorax. The air pocket pressing down like a fist. No time for a chest tube. No time for the surgeon to arrive. Just her hands and the training that lived in her muscle memory. She moved toward the stretcher where a veteran EMT stood catching his breath, still in his tactical vest, and she saw the canvas medical bag hanging from his shoulder, the kind they used in the field, stuffed with field expedient gear. The bag. Now. It wasn't a request. Her voice had dropped an octave, and the EMT didn't hesitate. He swung it toward her. Natalie's fingers found what she needed in 3 seconds flat. MRE packaging. Food ration material. The kind of thing you'd never imagine saving a 4-star general's life, but out here in Marjah it had worked 100 times, and the mechanics didn't change just because the walls were hospital white instead of desert tan. She stripped the packaging open. Clear plastic. Adhesive backing. She looked at Dr. Chen, the resident whose hands were shaking. 14-gauge needle. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Chen's eyes widened. That was the needle decompression site. The emergency hole. The last resort move that made the difference between alive and dead. He grabbed the needle. Natalie held the MRE packaging ready, her jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched, but her hands were steady as surgical steel. Chen's hands were not. He was 28 years old and he'd only read about this in textbooks. Breathe, Natalie said. Not an instruction. A command. Your hands are shaking because you're thinking too loud. Stop thinking. Feel the ribs. Find the space. Push. Chen pushed. The needle went through skin, through muscle, and then there was a sound that every combat medic knew, the hiss of air escaping. Pressure venting. Life returning to the space between lung and rib cage. The general's oxygen monitor climbed. 70, 75. 82. Natalie pressed the MRE packaging over the needle site, sealing it, creating a one-way valve that would let air out but not back in. Field hospital medicine. Life support held together with duct tape and desperation. It worked. Get me 2 units of O negative. Warming cabinet. Level 1 infuser. The commands came naturally, 15 years of experience crystallized into 4 sentences. Around her, the residents moved without questioning. A nurse she didn't recognize, newer staff, probably, started the infusion lines. Natalie positioned herself at the general's head, monitoring his airway, watching for the moment the natural breathing would fail and she'd need to take over. It came at 2:43 a.m. The ventilator hissed and stuttered. The endotracheal tube, the breathing tube, was occluded. Mucus. Blood. The general's oxygen sat dropping again, 88, 84, 79. Natalie was already moving. She disconnected the ventilator bag and began manual ventilation, squeezing the ambu bag in a steady rhythm, her other hand on the general's chest feeling for the rise and fall. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Like CPR, but the patient was still alive, just barely, and he was depending on her lungs for his own breathing. She kept that rhythm for 42 minutes while a resident suctioned the tube, while nurses adjusted medications, while the monitors beeped their constant electronic anxiety. Her arms burned. Her shoulders seized with fatigue. She didn't stop. At hour 3, his blood pressure tanked. Septic shock. His body mounting an infection response that was turning against him, blood vessels dilating, pressure dropping like a stone. Natalie didn't need anyone to tell her what was happening. She was living it through the numbers on every monitor, through the feeling of his pulse getting thready under her finger, through the way his skin turned gray despite the warming blankets. She looked at the bear hugger, the heated blanket system, and saw it was set to 38 degrees Celsius. Too cold. 42 degrees. Get the fluid warmer. TXA. 1 gram. Now. The tranexamic acid would help with clotting. The warmer would buy time. She was buying time, 1 minute at a time, because time was the only thing separating him from death. At hour 5, his heart rate climbed to 142. Tachycardic. Compensating. Fighting. She stabilized it with a medication the surgical team had left standing orders for. At hour 6, he crashed again. True cardiac arrest. No pulse. No perfusion. And Natalie did what she'd done in Marjah 100 times, she cracked open his ribs. The left anterior lateral thoracotomy. The move that belonged in the operating room, not an emergency bay, but there was no time, no surgeon, nothing but a 4-star general dying and her hands that knew how to open his chest and massage his heart. Her fingers closed around the general's left ventricle and she began compressions, feeling the heart muscle pump against her palm, manually driving blood to his brain. 1. 2. 3. The sensation was strange and terrifying and necessary. She'd done this before in dust storms and mortar fire, and now she was doing it in a Portland hospital while residents watched, transfixed, because they'd never seen this kind of medicine, had only read about it. The surgical team arrived at 3:17 a.m., 94 minutes after he'd crashed into the trauma bay. Natalie was still performing open cardiac massage, her hand inside his chest, her breath controlled, her face showing nothing. Dr. Merrick, the chief cardiac surgeon, took in the scene and didn't argue or hesitate. Clamp. Reboa. I need her right there, exactly where she is, until I get perfusion established. Merrick knew the resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta technique. He knew that stopping Natalie's compressions would kill the patient. He didn't say good job. He said, keep going. Natalie kept going. At hour 8, the general's vitals stabilized for the first time since arrival. BP holding at 105/68. Heart rhythm returning to sinus. oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal. The septic shock was retreating. The hemorrhage was controlled. And that's when Dr. Hayes appeared in the doorway of the trauma bay, his face a mask of professional concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Natalie." His voice was smooth, almost concerned. "You need to step back. Now." She was holding a retractor. The surgical field was open. The patient was mid-operation. She didn't turn around. "In 2 minutes," she said. Her voice was flat as a blade. "I'm not asking." Hayes took a step forward. "Security is at the door. You violated protocol, exceeded scope of practice. 2 minutes." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the general's heart, on the surgical field, on the monitors that showed him still fighting, still alive. "Or he dies. Your choice." Hayes stopped. She felt his hatred like a physical thing, a pressure in the room beside the fluorescent lights and the ventilator and the sound of the surgical team working. He turned and left. Through her peripheral vision, she saw him disappear back into the hallway. Security never came. Whatever calculation he'd made, whatever balance of optics and liability, he'd chosen to wait. At hour 10, General Morrison's bleeding stopped. His core temperature was back to 36.2 degrees Celsius. His kidneys were producing urine. His brain waves were showing activity. The surgical team had closed him, 3 hours of work compressed into coordinated motion and steady hands. Dr. Merrick looked at Natalie once, a single moment of eye contact that said everything his lips couldn't. She nodded. Once. Then she stepped back, peeled off her bloody gloves, and walked to the staff bathroom without a word. The water ran rust-red as she scrubbed, her hands under the scalding stream, watching the general's blood circle the drain. Her reflection in the mirror above the sink was hollow-eyed and gaunt, a stranger wearing her scrubs. She didn't recognize herself. For 18 hours, she'd been invisible as a nurse. For 10 hours, she'd been exactly what she'd tried to leave behind, a combat medic covered in someone's blood, making life-and-death decisions with the weight of 17 years of training crystallized into 4 commands. She dried her hands. Combed her wet hair with her fingers. Practiced her expression, neutral, empty, safe. Then she walked back to the nurse's station. Dr. Hayes was waiting. The night shift was arriving for handoff, 20 staff members gathering around the station for the 7 a.m. briefing, and he'd timed this perfectly. Natalie understood the calculation instantly. Public execution. Witnesses. No room for her to explain, no chance to defend herself. "Natalie Hayes, you terminated, effective immediately." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, formal in a way that made it official. Protocol violations. Practicing outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse. A documented pattern of instability we can no longer ignore. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You're to leave the building within the hour. She said nothing about Marjah. Nothing about Morrison. Nothing about why she'd abandoned a decorated military career because the nightmares had gotten so bad she couldn't sleep without hearing the sound of Chen's weapon firing, couldn't shower without feeling blood that wasn't hers, couldn't hear a helicopter without her hands shaking. Nothing about choosing this hospital, this obscurity, this careful anonymity, because being invisible was the only way to survive. She nodded once. Understood. Her voice was steady. Security escorted her to her locker. She packed the field journal with the pressed desert flowers inside, flowers she'd picked in Marjah the day she'd refused the order, the day everything ended, packed the cracked mug from her first duty station, packed the dying succulent she'd never managed to keep alive because she couldn't keep anything alive, couldn't even keep herself alive in ways that mattered. The photograph came last. Her fire team. Martinez, Chen, Rodriguez. 3 soldiers dead because she'd hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the IED detonated. The rain outside sounded like gunfire against the windows. That evening, Natalie stood at the bus stop 3 blocks from Sacred Heart, the cardboard box growing heavier in her arms, the contents soaking through in the downpour. A cracked mug. A dying plant. A photo of 3 dead soldiers. Everything she'd spent 2 years trying to leave behind, now the only things she had left. She didn't notice the text message coming through on her phone because the volume had been off for 8 hours. She wouldn't know that her face had appeared on the Portland Evening News until much later, when the world decided to remember who she was. The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. to the home of Richard Bancroft, the Sacred Heart Hospital board president. His wife had just fallen asleep. Dr. Marcus Hayes's voice crackled through the receiver with surgical precision, each word placed like a scalpel incision. "Richard, we have a serious problem. Reckless vigilante medicine. Protocol violations. I'm concerned about our liability exposure." Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He'd spent 23 years learning that power isn't loud, power is methodical. He mentioned the general, the unorthodox procedures, the risk to the hospital's accreditation. He suggested that perhaps the night shift nurse in question deserved a fitness review. Bancroft listened. Bancroft agreed. By 6 a.m., Hayes had called Natalie's nursing school references in Seattle, 3 calls to 3 former instructors, each one asking pointed questions about her psychological stability, her judgment under stress, her reliability. By noon, he'd contacted the Oregon State Board of Nursing with a formal complaint about credential irregularities and a pattern of unsupervised emergency interventions. Hayes built his case file the way a sniper builds a nest, methodically, with patience, from angles where no one could see the shooter. He compiled 17 documents, each one designed to bury her deeper. The file would look legitimate. The file would look inevitable. At 2:14 p.m., the night shift arrived for their evening briefing. Natalie was organizing supplies in the medication cart when Hayes appeared at the nurse's station. He didn't raise his voice. He rarely did. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes," he said, using her rank with the precision of someone swinging an axe. The room went still. Every head turned. "You're suspended pending investigation. Your credentials are under review. Your judgment is in question." The other nurses froze. One of them, Chen, let her pen fall to the floor. Hayes continued without inflection, "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your badge, your access, your authorization, surrendered now." He didn't mention Marjah. He didn't mention Morrison. He didn't mention the 10 hours she'd spent holding a 4-star general's life together in her hands while his organs tried to shut down. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that she was gone. Natalie didn't respond. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply placed the medication cart keys on the counter and walked toward the exit. Martinez caught her eye. Natalie nodded once, a gesture that carried weight across oceans of experience, across 7 years of watching her work, across 1,000 moments of seeing her do the impossible without asking permission or seeking credit. The hospital security guard, a man named Wilson who'd never looked at her twice before, escorted her to the lobby. She was carrying a cardboard box with the contents of her locker. She was wearing scrubs. She was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. What the state investigators discovered in their initial examination of Dr. Hayes's surgical records would reshape everything. They began checking his outcomes, mortality rates, complication rates, readmission percentages. They cross-referenced his reported results against billing records, hospital logs, patient charts. On day 3, they found the first discrepancy, a patient marked as recovered who'd actually been admitted to ICU 2 days later with septic shock. Then another. Then 4 more. The investigators pulled his last 5 years of cases, 217 surgeries. The discrepancies multiplied like cancer cells dividing. Falsified complication rates. Patients listed as discharged who'd actually died at other facilities. Medicare fraud to the tune of $847,000. Outcomes adjusted to inflate his success percentages. His network of allies, Bancroft, the board members, the colleagues who owed him favors, began receiving calls from federal investigators, not Hayes. Within 72 hours, Bancroft himself was being questioned about his knowledge of the billing irregularities. By day 4, the Portland Tribune ran the headline, "Celebrated War Hero Fired for Saving General's Life, Chief of Surgery Under Investigation for Medicare Fraud." Dr. Hayes' photograph appeared next to surgical fraud statistics. His wife, Catherine, stopped answering his calls. His attorney sent a letter explaining criminal liability. The scrutiny he'd invited to destroy Natalie's career instead became the instrument of his own annihilation. The nursing school confirmed in writing that Natalie had graduated summa cum laude. 3 of her former instructors sent statements describing her as exceptional. The state board found nothing, no irregularities, no instability, no pattern of unsupervised intervention. What they found instead was a combat medic who'd saved a general's life using field medicine in a civilian setting. That wasn't a violation. That was evidence of extraordinary capability. The investigation into Natalie revealed her record: top percentile in patient outcomes, 0 medication errors, commendations from physicians across 6 departments. The file Hayes had built with such care became evidence of his own malice. By day 9, he sat in his office, not his office anymore, though he didn't know it yet, staring at the same fluorescent lights that had illuminated his kingdom. The lights hummed their electronic dirge. The phone on his desk had stopped ringing 3 days ago. Outside the window, Portland's evening rain hammered the city like 1,000 accusers. His medical license was suspended pending the formal hearing. The hospital board had lawyered up. Bancroft sent a memo calling an emergency session without Hayes present. The vote was unanimous. The state board issued their findings 74 days after Hayes initiated his campaign against Natalie, guilty of Medicare fraud, falsification of medical records, and violation of patient confidentiality through misrepresentation of outcomes. Criminal charges followed within a week. The trial lasted for months. The conviction took 2 hours of jury deliberation. The sentence was federal prison, 18 months minimum, with restitution in excess of $2 million. But before the prison sentence came, before the conviction was final, Sacred Heart made him an offer. They needed a night security guard in the emergency department. The pay was $18.47 per hour. The shift was 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The uniform was blue polyester with a name tag that read security. He accepted because he had no other options. He needed the income. He needed something. On his first night, Wilson trained him at the ER entrance. Wilson was the Desert Storm veteran who'd recognized Natalie that day in the lobby, the one who'd said her call sign aloud, Reaper 6. Wilson checked Hayes' badge, showed him the security protocols, explained the checkpoint procedures. "You'll patrol the ER tonight," Wilson said, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Keep an eye on the trauma bays. Check credentials at the doors." Hayes nodded. Wilson paused before walking away. "Funny how things work out," Wilson said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't really a statement, either. It was an observation about the nature of the universe, about how the powerful sometimes learn what the powerless already know, that there are forces larger than ambition, and gravity always works. 3 weeks into his tenure as a security guard, the new director of emergency medicine arrived for her first day. She walked through the doors that Hayes now guarded. He was checking an intern's badge when he sensed her. He didn't need to look. He already knew. Natalie Hayes moved past him with the presence of someone who'd survived things he couldn't imagine. He looked at his clipboard and couldn't read the words. His vision had narrowed. He managed quietly, because that's what protocol required. She paused. For 1 second, exactly 1 second, she looked at him. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With nothing. With the kind of absolute absence of recognition that was far worse than fury. She nodded once and continued toward the elevator. She was wearing a white coat now instead of scrubs. It fit her like armor, like authority, like something she'd earned in ways he'd never understand. Behind her walked General Morrison in civilian clothes, moving slowly but moving, alive because of her hands, her judgment, her willingness to act when others hesitated. Hayes's jaw tightened. The general didn't look at him. Nobody looked at him anymore. Natalie's office overlooked the trauma bay where she'd performed the impossible. The field journal with the pressed desert flowers from Marjah sat on her desk beside the Navy Cross the general had delivered personally. The flowers were from a date marked in pencil, the date she'd refused an illegal order, the date everything ended, the date she'd chosen to save wounded civilians instead of obey. The journal was open to that page. The flower was still pressed flat after 17 years, still fragrant with the memory of Helmand Province, still perfect. She'd established new protocols, trauma-informed care for military personnel, mandatory de-escalation training for physicians, a peer review system that valued judgment over credentials. She was sleeping for hours a night. It was progress. Martinez had come by on her second week and brought coffee. Rodriguez sent a text, "Welcome home." Chen asked if she'd hire back 2 nurses who'd quit after the investigation, nurses who'd felt the weight of what Hayes had done. Natalie said yes immediately. By her 3rd month, she was walking the ER at 2:47 a.m. when she found Hayes in the waiting room with a disoriented elderly patient, his voice gentle, his movements careful, explaining where the bathrooms were and how to ring for the nurse. He was competent at this work. He was patient. He was good at something that required no ego, no status, only presence. She didn't speak to him. Some distances don't need closing. What happened next was quiet. No headlines. No drama. Just the ordinary work of rebuilding what had been broken. She caught a young nurse named Simpson making a medication error that could have caused a seizure. She sat with Simpson in the break room, explained the error without humiliation, helped her understand the recovery dosage calculations. Simpson cried with relief. Natalie thought about every moment she'd absorbed venom with one measured breath, every tear she'd wiped without breaking eye contact, every time she'd chosen not to destroy someone when she could have. That evening, she opened the field journal for the first time in 2 years and wrote in the margin of the page with the pressed flower, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She closed the journal. The flower stayed where it was, marking the moment when everything had changed, when she'd decided to save lives instead of follow orders, when she'd been buried and somehow, impossibly, risen again. Outside her office window, Portland's rain began to fall. The ER below her was humming with activity, monitors beeping, voices calling, the controlled chaos of people fighting for breath, for heartbeats, for one more day. She was home. After everything, despite everything, she was finally home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever watched power abuse itself, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, would you have walked away or stayed to fight? We release new stories every Tuesday and Friday.